Folks, Greg Barnes is a graduated BA LLB from Monash University in 1984. He was a member of the Victorian Bar where he practised in criminal law from 1986 to 1989 and has been a member of the Tasmanian Bar since 2003. Greg was Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to a number of federal and state Liberal Party leaders and ministers from 1989 to 99. He's also the former National Chair of the Australian Republican Movement and a Director of human rights group, Rights Australia. Greg has written 3 books on Australian politics, is a Director of the Australian Laws Alliance and a member of the Australian Defence Laws Alliance. Greg is a barrister, a columnist in the Mercury, an advocate for prisoners' rights and support of Aboriginal rights. Thank you, Greg.
Well, firstly, can I acknowledge the true inhabitants and the original owners of this land. I was going to say a low-profile columnist in the Hobart Mercury. Michael Mansell, who's here today, was first introduced to me way back when I was a 26-year-old barrister in Melbourne, and I never met him, but I heard all about him from a man who's my very best friend in life, Len Hartlett, who's a barrister in Melbourne. And it was through Len, who'd done a lot of work, I think, with Michael in the 1970s in the Aboriginal legal rights movement, that I first understood the racism of the justice system in Australia. And in particular, when Len used to go to Alice Springs and Darwin to do trials, his view was that if it was a black man or black woman who was the defendant and a white alleged victim, that you can forget about pleading not guilty, you would be convicted. That racism still exists, I should say, in the Northern Territory because it has the highest Indigenous jail rates in the country, which is utterly shameful. But can I focus on 3 very brief messages today? The first one is that you cannot have a day which purports to celebrate the achievements of a nation when the original owners of that nation are excluded. You cannot have a day when you saw white sails in the sunset coming into Botany Bay and you knew, as we now know, that that was the end of the Australia as it once was. And it took until 1992 for a relatively progressive High Court to end the fiction in this country that we live with. Those of us who are non-Aboriginal, we live with this, and that said that Aboriginal people had no rights to their land. That was only 20 years ago. Since then, we still have appalling rates of dispossession in the Aboriginal community. We still have a bitter division, as we saw when John Howard ruthlessly exploited and played the race card in the early part of this century. And we saw faux historians, and I call them faux historians, like Keith Winshuttle and others, trying to demean Aboriginal people and demean what happened to Aboriginal people with their head count, their sickening head count, and what justifies an invasion and what doesn't. We've got to move on from that, but you can only move on from that when this day just becomes another Saturday in January, when this day is simply the 26th of January. You can only have a true Australia Day when you have a day that is acceptable to the Aboriginal community and which recognises the Aboriginal community in this country. The second point I'd make, you cannot have a true Australia Day while you have a flag like that. A flag which utterly excludes the original inhabitants of this land. It's extraordinary that in a country that calls itself a liberal democratic society and likes to parade around the world showing off its, again I'd say, faux human rights credentials, that we have a flag like that. That is a flag which excludes and which demonstrates the racist culture that lives in this country. And yet we see no political leadership on the issue of the flag since again 1993 and Paul Keating. The last thing I would say, as a former chairman of the Republican movement, and it was good to see Wayne Swan out on the issue yesterday, you cannot have a true republic in this country which is not a republic which includes in the symbolism and in the way that it's written into the Constitution a recognition of a one Australia that includes and represents Indigenous Australia. We want a republic in this country. We want a flag that represents that represents a true Australia. We want a day which represents a true Australia, but you cannot do that until you make explicit recognition and you acknowledge the fact that there was an invasion of this country and that invasion has meant an enormous amount of suffering for Indigenous people, the sort of suffering that my old friend Len Hart used to talk about in the Northern Territory in the 1980s. Thank you very much.